Let's talk a little bit about the methodology, Chris and Richard, about the economic rankings. So as I understand it, Chris, 70% of 67%, you think of the variation can be described by walk score, and you get it to 90% with a couple of these other factors. I'm not a statistician, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So help me understand, causality versus coincidence here, because as I think about this, I wonder to what extent the walkability defines the success as defined by Rents, and how much of that is a consequence of the fact that these great places just happen to have strong walk. What comes first? Is it the walkability, or is it the location?
It's the chicken egg question that you're asking, and of course, Rich really alluded to that as well, and I think he confused sometimes the cause and effect, because the fact that Washington now is performing so well, but he also pointed out that 25 years ago we weren't exactly performing well. That downtown DC and DuPont Circle and the West End were like every other metropolitan area in the country where their downtowns had collapsed as we had moved out to the suburbs. And that the fact that it's come back now, because they're a walkable place, we should understand that relationship and understand that it was walkable 25 years ago as well, only you wouldn't be caught dead there. Then again, you might have been caught dead in downtown DC 25 years ago. And so that we need to understand that, in fact, the walkability had to come first. Walkability, which means that you're safe. One of the key reasons that this town turned around is because crime fell in the early 90s throughout the country. Social scientists still do not know why crime fell. Everybody has their pet theory, but nobody really has nailed why crime fell. But crime fell throughout the country, and that was a prerequisite for walkability to become acceptable again. But you see, walkability limits the place in its size. We want to walk somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 feet before we look for another mode of transportation. When you go back to your high school math, pi r squared, that means that we're looking at what the research showed, and that you'll see in the research, these walkable urban places are on average about 400 acres. That's what would result from looking at applying pi r squared to walking distance. And so walkability limits the size of these places, and therefore the density can go up, creating more excitement. And what these places become is more is better. As you add more, economic results get better. Quality of life gets better. Just as you add that next restaurant, add that next rental apartment in that place. And then the other thing that I do want to mention is the issue of comparing DC and the fact that it is not unique compared to the rest of the country. That I've done the research. Now, I did this at Brookings, not at GW, so perhaps the Brookings research is not quite as credible as GW, but I've done the research, and I have determined that 25 years ago, the federal government was in Washington. And it was a miserable place 25 years ago.
Dr. Green, you seem to say that location is primary and maybe walkability is the byproduct thereof. Where do you come out on this?
Well, that's why I put on my slide, I don't know whether I agree or I disagree. Because without getting into methodological details, what I would like to see is research that controls for location, particularly distance to commercial corridors, distance to metro stops, distance to what have historically been important economic centers for Washington, D.C. Because it's very easy for proxies to appear to matter when they're actually associated with something else that's going on. So at this point, I don't know. I would love to take the data, add some more what we call explanatory variables, and see how it turns out. I want to make clear, I am entirely willing to believe that walkability enhances value. I just don't feel like there's enough information to say so one way or another yet.
Yeah, and Chris has indicated this is the first step
Exactly.
of many more to
We need a
come.
lot more research on this. And this issue of a correlation versus causality is a very important issue. And this research needs a lot more verification and a lot more work done in different cities and, of course, over time. But the thing is that I'm also a real estate developer, and my partner is in the audience here, and he's asking me to write a check for a new project. It's a capital call that I have to decide upon in the next few weeks. I can't wait 10 years for the research, and nor can any other developer in this room. So we have to make decisions based upon the existing information.
So is it here in Washington?
No, it's up in Philadelphia.
Oh, that's tougher.
Yes, it is.
Because I want to, if I want to.
We're not going to get into the performer right now.
No.
Sorry.
But sorry, just on the so let me just draw a counterexample. Is I don't know how many of you have ever visited downtown St. Louis? Okay, think nice downtown, not so nice downtown.
It's coming back.
I think it has some beautiful buildings.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Buildings with wonderful bones. I actually like walking around downtown St. Louis. If you leave that little corridor of downtown St. Louis, though, what do you got? Nothing.
You don't have any downtown adjacent development yet.
And so there, and downtown location just isn't all that important in St. Louis. Most of the jobs are
But that
out
was
in
the same case
periphery.
here 25 years ago. And so what we're looking at is a spectrum. That DC's leading the charge. Boston, Portland, Seattle, Denver, San Francisco are following up. And then there's another level coming behind that, and there's another. And then at the far extreme tends to be in the Midwest. The St. Louis's, the Clevelands, the Kansas Cities that I know very well. And they're trying their damnedest to get in place the rail transit and the overlay zoning. But it's not everyone is at the same place on the spectrum as far as this trend. And I think part of the reason is because it goes back to the knowledge economy and all the educated workers. And Rich made a very important point about that DC is the essential knowledge economy place, that face-to-face involvement. And that in Detroit, making autos, you don't need the face-to-face involvement. Well, the knowledge economy, as Richard Florida has laid out extremely well, the knowledge economy is demanding that face-to-face involvement, which is why the creative class is demanding the option of walkable urban places.
I want to touch on transit and some other things, but let me keep and stay under the hood here for a second, because I was surprised by a couple of the rankings. And
I was too.
there are medals here, so there's a value judgment associated with the medals,
exactly.
right? So Tyson's Corner and White Flint actually got on the list. A question, should there be a lead? Are these aspirational walkable?
Actually, there was a lead, and I decided not to call them lead because my politically correct friend said you're going to make a lot of enemies. But the drivable suburban places are the 5th category, and those are below 70 walk scored. That just happens to be how the research dropped them out. And White Flint and Tyson's are two of the most important, as I mentioned earlier, two of the most important things to follow over the next 5 and 10 years. They have made the commitment to become walkable urban by putting in overlay zoning. And we'll hear from White Flint later on this afternoon from the president of one of the neighborhood associations who got behind the increased zoning. In essence, what we're seeing is NIMBYs becoming YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. And, but also, they've obviously invested in infrastructure. And the key issue with Tyson's is that the private sector ponied up about 25% of the cost of bringing those 4 stations out to Tyson's. They didn't have the benefit of this research, but this research indicates why those private sector developers said, we're going to tax ourselves to bring Tyson's here, or to bring Metro here, because we want to be like Arlington. That's why Tyson's is voting to triple its, or has voted to triple its density and put in Metro, because they looked at Arlington and said, we want to be like Arlington, just as White Flint looked at Bethesda and said, we want to be like Bethesda.
But the RB corridor, it took 20, 30 years to, so how?
Rome wasn't built in a day.
Agree, but how long is it going to take before you think that a Tyson's Corner truly qualifies as walkable?
Well, you know, a lot of it depends on the market conditions. I mean, is there in fact a market for office? Is there a fact, you know, right now we are running towards the end of the rental apartment spurt that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years. So, you know, these things never last forever. We are in the most cyclical business in the entire economy. And, but there's one, you're also going to hear about Capitol Riverfront. This is a remarkable place. This is a place that 12 years ago had a public housing project that had 19 murders the previous year. And that public housing project was replaced by a Hope 6 mixed income project. And the baseball stadium's down there, and thousands of rental apartments and for sale housing, and millions of square feet of office space. And in one cycle, I don't think I've ever seen this, it went from being one of the worst places in the district. This is where drug deals were in the shadow of the Capitol Dome. And that was 12 years ago. And in one cycle, they're now gold. They moved up the rank incredibly rapidly.
Yeah, and U Street and Milma, I mean, there are lots of examples in
So it
Washington.
can happen much quicker than we think.
Right.
Although I'm just curious, and this is just can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Absolutely, please.
So, the street grid down in where the new stadium
Lafont,
is,
we have a lot to thank him for.
yeah, is really conducive. Whereas when I think of Tyson's, and when I come in from Dulles Airport,
Exactly.
I see they're building new flyovers now.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not a great expert on walkability, but I know one of the issues is you have these incredibly broad boulevards that you have to cross.
Yep.
And if you do, that makes it unwalkable.
Exactly.
And, you know, so I live in California. I live in a neighborhood where there basically are no broad boulevards, so it's very easy to walk
I
from
used to live in Pasadena at one point, so
place to place. So it seems to me Tyson's is a much larger challenge.
it is,
than-
no question. That the drivable suburban transition from a Tyson's with, you know, 8-lane traffic sewers to fine-grained walkable urban is going to be the challenge of the next generation. So I tell my students that we baby boomers finally got it through our thick heads that we should redevelop our downtowns and our downtown adjacent places and our suburban town centers where the grid was in. It's up to you guys to figure out how to convert Tyson's and White Flint into a great walkable urban place. Because, you know, good Lord, if we had done everything, we wouldn't have left anything for them to do.
All right, so
But that is a big challenge.
So another ranking that surprised me a little bit, Silver Spring gets a copper rating at the lowest end of the spectrum. And as I think about Silver Spring, and Dr. Green, you know that submarket very well. It's walkable, it's transit rich, there's a lot of retail, there's office that's now going in there with Discovery headquarters and others, and there's a high level of social equity. So it makes me wonder how success is being measured in terms of walkability. And it comes back to the whole issue of rent, because the rents are not very high in Silver Spring, but I would say it's a successful walkable place.
And it is a successful walkable place, and it's come remarkably far over the last 5 to 7 years, particularly with the opening of the Discovery building, with the retail that went in there with Milt Peterson's company, who also developed, by the way, National Harbor. And so it's one of the best models because it is a walkable urban place that is also a platinum social equity place. So it is the most diverse place we have in this region that's a walkable urban place. And the numbers, though, show that the rents are lower than the silver and the gold and the platinum. So their challenge is to maintain that diversity while improving economic performance. And that is the challenge of place management. And the rest of the day, we're going to be hearing a lot about place management, which is a brand new field that a lot of my students have gotten into over the years, which is the 24/7 strategic and asset management of a place, generally provided by a business improvement district. But in the case of Silver Spring, It's a government function. They have a fabulous fellow there, Ramburdo Rodriguez, who is the manager of he is the place manager of Silver Spring, conscious 24/7. He's worrying at 4 o'clock in the morning how to achieve these kind of goals.
Dr. Green, how do you define success in place?
Well, that's a great question, and if it's a place that makes people happy that they live there, work there, shop there, then it's a successful place. And that's very vague, but I can't help think when and please call me Richard. If you're calling him Chris, call me
I
Richard.
will.
I mean,
Thank you.
otherwise, it's just either call it one thing.
Bow down before,
Right.
kiss your ring.
So creative people. So Ed Glazer did a
Right.
little response to Richard Florida, and you know where he found that the most creative people were in the whole country was Grapevine, Texas. If you've been to Grapevine, Texas,
I've been to Grapevine, Texas.
yeah, it's not what
You wouldn't
call it bohemian.
No,
Let's put it
no.
that way. So this is a real struggle that I go through when thinking about success, because there are a lot of places that personally I don't like, that clearly a lot of people like very much. I'll give an example from my region. There's a place called Irvine, California, developed by Don Bren. People love living in Irvine. And one of the reflections of it is it's an incredibly expensive place to live. It is remarkably, it's an ethnically diverse place. It has great schools. There are a lot of walking opportunities, but not on the streets. They basically have park reserve in the back of the houses and the office buildings, and you can take strolls on lovely trails. But if you want to go from your house to your work, you're getting in your car to do that. Okay. Now again, I would never live there, but lots of people really enjoy living there. So defining what a successful place is, I think, is really dependent on tastes and preferences. Where I have an issue is, for many years, because of zoning, we have not allowed people the opportunity to have a choice of different kinds of places. And you know, I get a little, I sort of pick on sort of the urbanist enthusiasm from time to time, but you look at, Joel Kotkin did a piece about 2 weeks ago or a month ago in Cities Journal where he complained about upzoning in Hollywood. So Hollywood has fairly low levels of zoning. There's a new zoning plan that's come out that would allow for high density residential. If you've been to Hollywood, you know if there's ever a place in the country that should have high density, it's Hollywood. It's surrounded by incredibly valuable real estate. The real estate in Hollywood per se is not all that valuable, in part because you can't build very much on it, but it's surrounded by very high value real estate. It has 2 metro stops on it that actually, where the ridership is already very good. And Joel Kotkin, who's always been, he says, an advocate for people making their own choices, has come up against upzoning in Hollywood. Now the thing about upzoning is it doesn't force anyone to build a tall building, it just allows people to build a tall building. I think the market is such that tall buildings would work really well there. It allows for up to 50 stories. I don't know that that's right, but 20-story apartment buildings certainly.
Yeah.
So I think the key is you have to figure out a way to do land use so that the market basically determines how the land is used, taking into account externalities. So again, cars create externalities, people should pay for them. Big houses create externalities, people should pay for it. But if people are paying the real cost of driving a Suburban or living in a big house, then let them do it. And then see what happens. Paris developed before the Euclidean zoning.
Exactly.
Well, I was worried, what are we going to talk about for an hour and a half, and it's flown by. I did promise an opportunity for those of you to get involved in the conversation, so if there are any questions, they're in the back.
Chris, did you look at the role parking plays in development cost in these places, and if not, do you have any sense of what kind of factor that would be?
No, I did not look at the parking ratios, but of course, as you know, and that's Bob Dunphy, I believe, Bob, that parking is critical. Parking is part of the transportation system. We do know that of course, as these walkable urban places evolve, the parking ratios plummet. And, and we have it right here at GW, that they took down the parking deck for GW to put up the science building, which is under construction right now. There's virtually, there's almost no parking on this campus, and that's just fine. It wasn't fine 20 years ago when this was pretty much a commuter campus. So as it becomes more walkable, we see the shift of these places, like downtown Pasadena. When downtown Pasadena started to revive, when I lived there in the 80s, it was a dump, like most walkable urban places were dumps. The market didn't want it. It had great used bookstores, which I liked, and really divey bars, which I also kind of liked. And, but that was it. Today, I spoke at the downtown Pasadena meeting. It was their annual meeting for their downtown group. The same day, Tiffany's opened their store on Colorado Boulevard. I mean, obviously a bit of a turnaround over the last 25 years. When they were starting the turnaround, the parking ratio was suburban in nature. It was 4 to 5 parking spaces per 1,000 in publicly provided parking decks. Today, it's about 1 parking space per 1,000. They just haven't built any more parking. They have put in the light rail, and they've densified the downtown tremendously, and they need to do even more. So parking ratios drop as people have the option. See, right now, most places that are suburban, you are dictated by law that you must drive if you want to participate in society. And it's a top-down approach. What Pasadena and GW and other walkable urban places have found is that you provide a portfolio of different transportation options, and people find different ways to get there. Some will still take a car, but the parking ratio needed to satisfy that is much reduced.
So we know that parking drives development, right? I mean, I grew up hearing that statement.
And that's what I've been saying for years, but that was driving drivable suburban development.
Right. But so it leads me back to transportation again. If I read it correctly, your report said that that transit is not necessary, but it's important. So in the success of a place, how important is transit?
And again, this goes back to a very important point that Richard made, which is that we don't know causality yet. But of the 43 walkable urban places here, almost 80% have rail transit service, but 20% don't. There's 8 places, like National Harbor, like Reston Town Center, that do not have rail transit, and they're working, and they're doing quite well, quite honestly. So it is not a requirement, but it obviously sure does help if you give people that many more options by which to get there, not just bus, biking, car, and walking, but you also add rail transit.
Richard,
Can I just...
how important is transit?
Well, the problem, I think people associate transit with rail.
Yeah.
And buses
Play
are
a huge
really
role.
important. And if we're thinking about it from a national perspective, most cities in the U.S., the vast majority of cities in the U.S., do not have the critical mass necessary for rail.
I disagree.
To be sensible.
I disagree.
But frequent, okay, that's going to be a long conversation.
yeah.
But frequent bus service
Right.
can be a very viable means of getting people to use public transportation. And one of the issues is if you don't have sufficient frequency of the buses, then people won't use it. But
And there's a stigma associated with it.
Absolutely, in this country. Not in South America, not in Europe, but in this country. Transportation drives development. People get that relationship mixed up. They assume that you have to have density, then you can justify rail transit. The logic is backwards. Transportation drives development, and it has for 6,000 years of building cities. And I learned this from Governor Brown, not Governor Jerry Brown, Governor Pat Brown. Had breakfast with him a few years prior, after he got out of office, and he and I was a young pup. And he was telling me about how he pushed the freeways out into the San Gabriel Valley, out into the San Fernando Valley, and people thought he was nuts to put 8 lanes of concrete to service orange groves. And he said, transportation drives development, it'll fill in. It's the same thing with rail transportation, that until you put in the rail transportation, you won't get the high density. So it is, that the reason you build transportation systems, particularly rail transit, is to create economic development. It's not to move people. It's to create economic development. And so that's why many, many of our cities are missing out, though, of course, as Governor Glendening mentioned, of the 300 ballot measures, mostly for rail transit, 70% have passed. And so people in their gut know we need to put it back in the rail transit system. And the longest rail transit system, of course, in the world in 1945 was Los Angeles. And they're now in the middle of putting it back in. The
Yeah,
largest.
we have a lot of track. But let me give an example in Los Angeles, the Blue Line, which goes from downtown LA down to Long Beach.
I've taken it.
Okay. The downtown node and the Long Beach node do very well. Nothing has developed in between.
Because it's the non-favored quarter. The favored quarter goes to the west, and that's where development, like in Hollywood, is taking place. The non-favored quarter is where Watts is, and that's where the Blue Line goes. And so hopefully, like we've seen the expansion of the favored quarter here, just beginning to see it go to the northeast and southeast, that hopefully places like Los Angeles will see development, rather than going due west out to Westwood, out to Santa Monica, will also begin to go south.
Well, one of my critical roles here is to keep us on time. And I know that we are reaching the end of our time here, so I'm just cutting into your break and time to chat about these, and we will continue the conversation for the balance of the day. I do want to ask you an exit question briefly, if I can. So, Richard, to start with you, what was the most surprising thing that you learned in reading through this research?
I wasn't expecting that question. You surprised me with that question. The rent premiums are really big. Again, that's why they were so big. I wonder if it's something else that's going on.
It's too good to be true, right?
Yeah, but $36 a square foot for office space that's the most expensive office space outside of Manhattan in the United States, I think. Mm-hmm. And that makes me wonder: is it particularly Washington?
So that was a big surprise. So same question for you, Chris, but I want you to add on and explain the socks.
The socks are because guys have no options as far as how we can dress, as far as doing something wild and crazy. We only have socks and ties.
And ties.
You got underwear, but we won't go there. What was the thing that was most surprising to you?
Most surprising about this research was how it divided between the suburbs and the center city. And that this is more about the transformation of our suburbs, and probably because of the better schools out there for the people that are leaving DC to go to Arlington and go out to Bethesda. That really surprised me, that this was really a suburban story, even more so than a turnaround of our center city, which has been dramatic and positive.
Dr. Richard Green, Professor Chris Lineberger, thank you very much. Join me in thanking you.
The three individuals on the panel deal with this topic every day. We have Prince County Executive Rashawn Baker, Richard Bradley, Executive Director of the Downtown BID, and Jair Lynch, President of Jair Lynch Development. Steve Moore's career has been in marketing, event planning, and merchandising, promoting business and retail opportunities. Prior to joining the WARF Project, Steve was CEO of the Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership and Deputy Director of the Downtown BID. Most of Steve's career was with the Rouse Company, where he directed the strategic planning, marketing, communication of many of the Rouse Company's urban projects. Thank you, Steve, and the panel.
Good morning, everybody. So we want to have a conversation picking up a little bit on what we just heard from the previous presentations. Some of it I think that is spot on with the gentleman to my left and where they are in their own work, and some of it may not fit so well. We'll see a little bit as we get into the discussion. As was just presented, so 3 different points of view on walkable urban places, a policymaker, a developer, and a place manager, a little bit by design. So we'll have a chance to hear from them. What is it that they're working on? Why is it that the work we've just seen, or Chris's sort of new thinking about urban places, fits for what it is they're doing, and perhaps in some cases why it does not? Again, just by way of introduction, the County Executive, Rashawn Baker, is here from Prince George's County. Jair Lynch is the president of Jair Lynch Development Partners, and Rich Bradley is the president and CEO of the Downtown DC Business Improvement District. Gentlemen, welcome. Rashawn, can we start with you?
Sure.
So a minute ago, we were in the back, and you were talking about your program around neighborhood development. And it struck me as I was listening to you that that was a better way sort of to start this conversation than just referring back to Chris's work and some of the earlier presenters. Take a minute, if you would, and walk through kind of your own thinking about that, and then your response to Rich's question about how it has to work across agencies.
Well, one of the things that we're focusing on in the county, which is really going to be the philosophy of this administration, is what we call transforming neighborhoods. And that is, we looked at 6 of the neighborhoods throughout Prince George's County, which are have the highest needs, whether it's education, public safety, lack of economic development, all of those indicators, and we rolled them into one and looked at it. It just so happens they happen to be inside the Beltway and near a metro station. So when we talk about how we're going to focus on the long term for developing walkable, sustainable neighborhoods, these 6 communities are where we're going to put the resources, not just in economic development, not just in planning, but in healthcare, education, and transform those neighborhoods into the type of places we want people to live, to work, and to shop.
So Chris's work then urges you as a policymaker to make a bet. In a way, bet on places where people will have a walkable experiences, where businesses will be nearby. Talk some about that.
Well, you take, for example, if we look at Suitland, which is a great example I like to use. My kids went to Suitland High School. It has one of the best performing arts high school in the state of Maryland. It has federal enclaves there. It has a metro station. It's near the District of Columbia, but yet it has problems. It's basically an urban area in a suburban county. So changing our philosophy to feed off what some of the good stuff that's happened in DC into the county and change those neighborhoods into places not only where the government's going to locate, but also where we can get private sector to locate.
Jair, so talk for a minute now. You're developing in the district. You're pretty well grounded in Chris's work and thinking about walkable places. Spend a minute, sort of by way of introduction. How does that inform your work? How does it kind of drive the decisions you make, the projects you pick to do?
Well, I think it's very much paramount in our overall philosophy. But I think one of the things that would be great to reflect on is you have a policymaker, a developer, a place manager. It would be great to have is the financier as the 4th chair, because I think if you had all of us in a room over a glass or a bottle of wine, we could really carve out where value could be created. Because there's a constant tension, especially in a walkable neighborhood where the retail and the street experience is so important, where your lenders or institutional equity partners will drive you toward the simplest, safest solution that may not be the best solution for a streetscape that would help a policymaker, but will provide security and predictability, but may not be the best solution for placemaking. And being able to carve that pie out is really the challenge of urban development in walkable urban places. And we find that those conversations are often segmented between different people. And if we're able to have those conversations where whether we shave off some parking that allows us to drop rents, that then allows us to take risks on local businesses, I think all of those decisions and trades will actually benefit the project and or the neighborhood.
Yeah, very good, very good. I know you brought some images. Would you take a minute and talk about the work of a business improvement district? And then, having been downtown since 1997 that I know of, talk about how it's changed a little bit and how all of this work informs being a place manager.
Well, first of all, let me just say, as a recipient of one of the highest designations here, I'm afraid I brought the wrong shoes. I don't know if I should have walking shoes or something, but clearly Clark has got to get behind this, and when we get these designations, somebody ought to give you a shoe, a walking shoe of some kind. So I'm pleased to have that designation, because certainly years ago, as Chris said, if you came to downtown Washington, it's not a place you hung around, you walk very much, and if anything, you probably walk very quickly with a sense of anxiety. So there really has been a dramatic change. I think what's fueled it is, and I guess the case that I want to make today for something we would call management, an organization, that there is what you referred to, a place manager, some organization, some group of people who say, we need to make this place better, and let's bring attention and focus to that place. And what that really is essentially a way of organizing those who are already there to do that. There's a famous movie that Kevin Costner was in called Field of Dreams. If you remember the expression, build it and they'll come. Well, I think those of us in our field say, build it and they'll come, manage it and they'll stay. And what we often forget is that we think just building it, just offering it is going to be sufficient. I mean, Chris was noting, there really hasn't been a fundamental change in the landform in downtown Washington in 20 years. So it's not the design of the place, the sidewalks were there, the streets were there. What's different now is that there's just a far greater degree of attention to the kind of details that make that work. I mean, I will spend sometimes an hour getting briefed about the best way or the best solvent to get the stain left after the gum buster has gone by and gotten the gum off, but the stain is there. I mean, it's that attention to detail that is part of what some of us talk about in bid world. You're at one level dealing with that over and over again. And it's the issue of, again, the management of place. But I want to distinguish that, and it's really the second part, is the strategic management of place. It's of equal importance to us, besides worrying about the gum, is to worry about the use on the side. We're getting the gum off, but if we don't have enough housing to attract people, what do we need to do that to help with that? And years ago we were able to convince Mayor Williams and others to create tax abatement in downtown as a stimulus for residential development. So you work on those two levels of essentially the detail and then the use, and together they begin to sort of fill in the space, if you like. When I say the space around the built environment, fill in the space with the kinds of uses and the attention to the space that make it livable.
The other thought I had was that, and it goes to something you had said backstage as well, is about staying with it. So you've been there for 15 years. I mean, this was, sort of euphemistically described earlier as dirty, dull, and dangerous, which, by the way, it isn't now. We all know that. But you've been there for quite some time. And so there's continuity about a vision about how you're going to manage it, and you rallied kind of every major property owner around you for a long time to engage in conversations. This, again, is your point about Hyattsville. If I could, the two of you, talk about that a little. Don't you have to stay with it?
You do. I mean, there are three people in this audience who actually started what we have in Prince George's County, which is our arts district. One is Governor Glendening, when he was governor, had Smart Growth, which allowed funds to come into areas that built around metros and walkable communities. Certainly, council member at the time, Peter Shapiro, had the vision to say, if we build this arts district, and Jay Green was at housing and redevelopment. The difference between what happened in Hyattsville and what you see creating in Prince George's County now, and what happened in Suitland, where we put the exact same amount of money. I think we put $6 million into both projects. The difference was the Suitland project was a one hit. You put $6 million in there, you expected a miracle for it to change. It didn't. Hyattsville, on the other hand, the arts district was $6 million, then was added to with the private sector, then was added to with the city municipality, but was kept with it for this period of time. And so now you start to see the fruition of that and the growth around the metro, the Rhode Island Avenue, and you're expanding it all the way even up to from Mount Rainier all the way up to College Park. But it's that continuity of staying with it over a long period of time.
Is that right? Continuity, staying with it?
Yeah, I also think, though, that has to be done through an entity that's both independent of the public sector and independent of the private sector, but in some respects is an amalgam of the two. Right. The bids, in general, are kind of more sort of amalgam of the private and the civic sector in a neighborhood. in large part because it makes it easier to work with the city, but in essence, we're a partner with the city in everything we do. But we're not bound by any particular term or limit, and you've got to be able to go multiple years. I mean, when we started in the downtown, and Steve, you were part of this, kiddingly, we didn't have a branding mix. We couldn't brand the downtown, because if we did, it was dull, dirty, and dangerous. And in fact, the first slogan we developed was, "Come see for yourself." Well, in other words, we could meet anybody's expectations. Whatever you expected, come see for yourself. I mean, it was hardly a brand. And it wasn't until 10 years into the work that we could actually sit down and say, what's the promise of the experience here? What can we give people certainty about that we're going to deal with? So it was 10 years before we then thought about being able to announce that downtown was inviting, it was smart. In some respects, what we now have is a kind of a brand, is an exceptional urban experience. That's the brand promise.
Yeah, but so,
the exceptional urban experience. But it was 10 years before we could announce that. So there has to be an organization created that sustains itself over time, but enjoys the support, very important, of the key leadership in the government, and the key leadership in the business community, and the key leadership in the civic community to that end, and then is given enough resource to stay in the game over that period of time.
So to pick up on what you were saying, in Chris's work, he's making the point now that there's an expanded role. He doesn't say BID specifically, but he means business improvement districts, I think. Yeah. But there's an expanded role for a BID that's everything from a catalytic style development company, somebody who can put property together, all the way over to an events management company. And I was thinking back again about you starting 6 or so neighborhoods at one time. Are you thinking about an entity like this? And could you comment on what the expanded role of a BID might look like?
Yes, certainly. What we want in those 6 neighborhoods is for the government to do the things that it can only do within its power, which is you've got to change the education system there. You've got to make sure public safety is a part of it, healthcare, access to quality healthcare, and then the private sector. The partnership of having the private sector come in and see the potential, and that's one of the reasons why we in Prince George's County, in addition to having these 6 focus areas, have what we call our Economic Development Incentive Fund, $50 million where we incentivize for you to come in and see the opportunities there. Because without the private sector and the nonprofit sector coming in and sustaining it, it's not going to last. Because and you're absolutely right, it's going to take more than just one administration. It's going to take multiple. And so that's where the private sector and the government sector intercede.
I often thought, too, that the $50 million sort of signaled we're serious about this.
Exactly.
Yeah. Rich.
Well, let me just say, it was an interesting way to respond to where can bids go. I was in a meeting with Jair recently, and we were talking about the southwest section of DC, and that it's going through a transformation. But it's one of the few areas for which there really isn't a brand identity. If you go back 30, 40 years ago, there was redevelopment activities that took place there. It never sort of took off. What Jair noted, and it was kind of fascinating, was what the consequence of the Silver Line coming in the Orange Line, and what it's going to mean, interesting, for reverse commuting. And who will be living here, and how do we accommodate what they need? And this gets to, besides sort of the issues of sort of management, who organizes that community over there for what market?
Yeah.
And how do you then build for that market? Because I think it's going to be a different kind of market. The people who will probably reverse commute don't want as much space. Jair is kind of actually developing new kinds of residential forms to take advantage. So I think the bids of the future are as much concerned about, again, this laying the groundwork for the future, organizing developers, creating not just a vision for the community, but a vision for the kind of options, the lifestyle options. Maybe you want to kind of comment, because you've really been working on this whole notion of a different lifestyle that's emerging here and having designed for it.
Right. The way we've been thinking about the maturation of place is that there needs to be a key actor that cuts across administrations or agencies, as well as just the business interest. In our thoughts, it's more like a neighborhood improvement district. And we understand the origins of a business improvement district, and that's perfectly appropriate in central business districts. But when you step out to walk-ups and walkable urban places, neighborhood improvement districts probably is the more appropriate descriptor. And the functions will be very much the same as business improvement district, but they'll likely be working very early in the arc of maturation, and they'll be laying out planning and other policy goals with the government to really be able to get to a place where there's a brand and get to the place where there's some activity so that it can work on its own. As you indicated, it took 10 years before a brand promise could arrive in downtown. You may have similar metrics for a neighborhood.
I think it's interesting. I spent some time with the woman who's the principal of the school right across the street from the Wharf Project, thinking in terms of neighborhood, not just the development project. Right. 176 kids in that school. Last year, no more than 4 parents ever showed up for a PTA meeting. And I began to think you're right, why don't we bring the neighborhood association over to these guys and play a different kind of catalytic role that's not just, just attracting retailers or making sure we develop parking lots.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up as a project that Jair's engaged in at Milton Reservoir, for those of you who know it on North Capitol. But it's interesting, you think about that part of the city in which you have sort of on one side of it, you have Howard, on the other side of it, you have Catholic University, you have these medical complexes, but if you go up there, it doesn't have any sense of place.
Yeah.
And no one's attended to it.
Yeah.
And yet there's huge opportunity, there's land to be developed up there, and a development proposal went out to get a developer to take McMillan, but you've chosen, in effect, to think what we really need to do is staff this with someone who can begin to work organizationally. And there are other proposals to create compacts among the universities and the hospitals to do that. But this is an area of the city that could be remarkable for us.
Absolutely.
In the future. It's already there, it's kind of got the bones, but someone's got to knit it together. And maybe you want to talk a little about your intention there, but it's a good example of what we're still doing this almost the way you're doing it in the county. We're actually still doing it in the city. It isn't just that we're going to commercial areas, it's going to places where there are institutions that could be more.
Right, and we definitely have learned over the years that you have to look beyond your building or your project. In some cases, it's a single building or even a group of buildings. And you have to think through the entire neighborhood, what it is today and what it could become, which is why we were able and fortunate to fund a project director with an incredible talent in Ann Corbett, who sat under your wing for many years, who now will be thinking about the McMillan area as an entire district that has over 15,000 jobs just at the Washington Hospital Center, has 4 or 5 major universities, has transit within a mile, that just 1 or 2 large gestures from both a public and private perspective could make that an entire district with 1 more neighborhood past the Central Business District and NOMA. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, what Jerry is talking about is exactly our Transforming Neighborhoods initiative in the county, and so I'm pleased to hear the work that he's doing. It's what we're trying to do in Prince George's County. The other thing is I'm looking forward to the McMillan site being developed. I spent the first 10 years of my life doing community development in DC, and that was one of the projects we tried and we couldn't do. But it has such great potential. It's just like you said, it has every major indicator that says this should transform. You've got major universities, you've got a major hospital there, and you've got great housing stock. So you don't really have to change the housing stock, it's changing the quality of life around it and figuring out how it fits in. Well, that's similar to what happens in Prince George's County in many of these 6 neighborhoods. Great housing stock, great opportunity, but how do you mix in what the government's doing, what the community wants, and making it attractive enough to sustain not just business, but retail, residents, and quality of life. And those things go to education, healthcare, public safety.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Before we made it to the stage this morning, Chris made a pretty compelling case for sets of statistics that support the notion that walkable places the real estate values are higher, sets of other numbers. And he releases the report, I think, later today. But he had said in his sort of introductory notes to the report that what a policymaker would do, what a place manager would do, particularly maybe a policymaker would do, would make the right things easy. And he was in explaining that, he said the need for overlay zoning, the need for appropriate high density, encouraging mixed-use development, encouraging higher density in areas where currently there's lower density. My question is really, and maybe this is for everyone, what is the right thing and how do you make it easier?
It's a good question. I think for us in the county, it's unlike the city. It's getting people to change their philosophy. I mean, as a suburban county, people are used to moving out there for housing, residential housing, as I said on a program this morning. 70% of our income comes from residential housing. That was our business. Our business was not how do you develop a job center, walkable areas inside the Beltway where we have the most opportunities. Well, thanks to the collapse of the economy and the price of gas, and the growth of the district, people are looking inside the Beltway areas for potential. And so I think from a government standpoint, it's one, to incentivize, which is why we have the $50 million, one, to make development more attractive inside the Beltway by making the zoning process and going through permitting process easier, and two, really aggressively go after developers like Jair to come out and to want and look at Prince George's County or places like it and want to do development there.
Yeah, very good. What do you think?
I think it always comes down to predictability, and you just touched on easier to the point where it's predictable. Because when it's predictable, then you are willing to take on the many other risks that are maybe out there, and you can now isolate one and say, well, entitlements and dealing with the municipality is not on my high list. I would say the second thing is really understanding that place management has to be built into our performas, our thought processes, appraisers' mentality, the bankers. Everyone needs to really think about how does the place mature over time, and who are the actors that do that. And it may or may not be the developer. And often, to get the real bang for the buck, it's going to be some other organization that can help with that.
Yeah, very good. What do you think?
Well, I would add to this the importance of mixed use and mixing uses. Maybe it's mixing uses. We sort of, 20 years ago in downtown Washington, the reverse problem Rasheen has in Chicago, where the use is all residential, we were all office. And there was really an understanding about the developers that finally bought into the comp plan about what we called preferred uses, that we really needed to mix uses in some way, shape, or form. And where that really got expressed in a fascinating way was in the planning of the old convention center site, which is now the city center project. The paradox here, the irony was that was to have been the first mixed-use project in downtown Washington. Well, it turns out that the downtown it got ahead of the project. That's now the capstone. But we were all focused. We said, we've got to we designed the space in a big debate. Should there be an acre of open space? We need to be able to program the space. The developer would have to have a common area charge that would provide for events in that space. There had to be a mix of uses. There had to be a mix of income. It was all intentionally focused on it. And the city essentially really subsidized that in large part by, in effect, allowing the land value. Instead of selling that site, which it could have sold for $350 million then, and it's not been able to harvest anything yet from that, it now will have a project that will generate on an annual basis $50 million in perpetuity, plus have thousands of jobs. But it was that conceptually moved us forward. The developers basically kind of agreed at this point in time we really needed to do that. And so little by little, our intention over time was, first of all, we focused on residential, and therefore we got the tax abatement program. The second thing we focused in on were the cultural institutions, and so began to subsidize, whether it was expansion of Shakespeare Theater or the theaters themselves. And lastly, retail, and there was a retail TIF that was put in place to begin to make that move. Now, with the city center project coming in, all of those will sort of be accelerated by that development. And so for the first time in 2 years' time, we will be a regional destination for retail. Yeah. We will go from 900,000 to close to 1.3 million a retail base. And instead of being just a super regional destination for office and maybe cultural, we now add this other dimension. But the fascinating thing along the line here is that it will go to a new level. And just to give you a sense of how these cycle through, The big issue we're facing in that area around, if you like, 7th and 8th Street, which many people are familiar with, is to realize that 7th Street isn't big enough anymore. It just isn't wide enough. And our expectation is between 10 to 20% more people will be coming into that area on a daily basis, and on some nights we'll have 100,000. So we're back to thinking about how much security do we need? Do we have to have people stationed there who are trained in first aid? Do we need to have public works out there picking up trash until 2 o'clock in the morning? We need the property owners to be coordinating with each other in terms of surveillance systems. We need to change the size and nature of our streets and pedestrian crossings. So the point is, it's continual. You push it up to a certain point, and then you keep doing it. But once again, to come back to the point, that's our job as the sort of place manager, to be continuously thinking about it. It's not that the city's not thinking about it, but they're thinking about it everywhere. But we have to get up there every single day and say, what is it we can do over time to enhance and enrich this place?
Yeah, very good. So we're going to invite you to join this conversation with us. I've got one more question for these guys. And then all you need to do is raise your hand. I'll see you, call you. Either a question or a comment for any of them, something that occurred to you either in the earlier presentations or something that came up now that you want to discuss. We would welcome you to join the conversation with us in just a minute. One more question, and maybe Rich will start with you. And I think of this as kind of another hard one. A lot of Chris's work is dependent upon infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure. And yeah, it's certainly the metro, but it's also everything else, right down to bicycles. If it's key to making these ideas work, who pays?
Everybody. Everybody. And we're in the midst of an interesting conversation right now. From the downtown point of view, as much as we had Metro, if most of you now know, there's another service down there. It's called the Circulator. And that was essentially because we knew we needed something else. So the Circulator was something that took 7, 8 years to get up. We put some money on the table as a kind of starter. The convention center put some money, city put some money. We had hoped to get more private money. Well, it became something that we began to realize, other than it became a way for people in the city to get to jobs. So it became a city service. So the next thing we paid attention to, and we knew it was coming right from the start, is the streetcar. This is a city that will become a streetcar city. So the conversation right now about how will we finance a streetcar, not just through the downtown, but out Georgia Avenue, H Street, is sort of been focused on what people call value capture. And in fact, Chris did some work for us to kind of help us try to understand how could we, if you like, harvest the benefit of the increased real estate values and put them into the project. And tax increment financing does that, or special assessment, which was used to do the metro station at New York Avenue, which financed the NOMA area. It was at least a catalyst for that. So those are examples of sort of trying to capture it private. But as we wrestle with this, as we're going forward to try to figure out how do we do this system-wide, we're beginning to realize that this is an amenity like schools, in the same sense that I don't have any kids in the public schools, but I'm still paying taxes for schools. And I think what we're going to begin to think is this mobility is a community benefit, and therefore it should be a combination of things. Maybe it gets started through a special assessment district, or someone pays in that. But I think we're going to look for more complex kinds of financing institutions to do this, and structures. But the point that I want to make here is that mobility is an amenity for a community. And we have to just find ways of appropriating, if you like, the costs of that to who should pay. But that's my...
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Jair, what do you think?
We think mobility is absolutely paramount in terms of making walkable urban places come alive. And we do think that it'll affect the people who will live there or work there, but it is an amenity that will affect an entire city. It'll affect business. And so when you start thinking that broadly, then you start realizing that the layered cake becomes fairly dense, in the sense that it's everything from hotels occupancy, from office occupancy, it's sales tax, it's all kinds of different ways in which you can capture components that then put this fabulous amenity on the table. And we think it's a network. We don't think it's make a decision to just do light rail but not think about bicycle modes of transportation or fractional use or other things. It really needs to be thought through in a network. And it also needs to be something that runs through the arc of the maturation of place. And you may be thinking that regionally or hyper-local, but regardless, it's very much essential in making sure that the new customer that is typically open to the ideas of different components of mobility, you provide that amenity front and center because they gravitate to it immediately.
Rashawn, transportation.
Yes, I think it's good. You know, it's interesting when we talk about economic development, especially at the government level, and I found this being county executive, it's usually a discussion about infrastructure. Infrastructure is almost always paid for by the government. We would not have National Harbor had we not redone Woodrow Wilson Bridge and had the infrastructure to do the interchange, as the governor can tell you, that the project wouldn't have gone forward. Conterra in the north in our county wouldn't go forward without $26 million from the state. So the question becomes, where do you get the resources? Because developers take risk. And so they want to know that, you know, the government, which wants to, you know, spur this economic development, is also going to take risk, whether it's widening the streets, whether it's doing streetscapes. The question is always cost. This past year, I supported a gasoline increase, which not a lot of people liked. But I said, well, do you like walkable communities in our urban areas around around these metros? Because it's all going to require not just the metro itself, but streetscape, widening of streets, narrowing of streets. All of that's going to go into development. So I think what has to happen is, how do we get municipalities and governments to understand, one, you've got to put the money in there, and two, how do you target it? And so one of the things that we've done in this administration is take our $32 million that we're putting into transportation and target inside areas like these six transforming neighborhoods areas where we're going to do infrastructure, and that way as an incentive to developers to come in and to develop in these targeted areas.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Rich.
I just wanted to, I think we're on the front edge of a very dramatic change in how we finance infrastructure. And I think it became obvious to the people in the district with the changing nature of this work. About 2 months ago, the Bank of China showed up at the mayor's door and said, we'd like to make some investments in the city. And so the mayor started naming a few projects of this project or that project, 20 million here, 30 million there. And they said, well, thank you very much, that's very nice, but we started $1 billion. Today, there's capital is available throughout the world at the cheapest prices we've ever known. And in large part, what a lot of that, particularly I would say overseas capital, is the certainty that you can get here. The issue is the scale in a strange way, and the returns. What we do is we kind of part, but they in a similar fashion, they went to San Francisco, and it turns out there's an area, I think, south of Candlestick Park. It's almost a neighborhood that's kind of growing, and it's been on the books for about, and they said, well, why don't we invest the $1 billion there in that area? We'll help this area grow. We just want a dedicated source of revenue to repay the bonds. That doesn't pass through the city. We want it dedicated directly to this. So they're actually taking a whole area and building it at that level. What the city has done with this particular proposal that they came is now said, oh, we were going to do the next line of the streetcar. It's about $500 million called the One City Line that kind of goes from Minnesota Benning to Georgetown. And we're $380 million of public money here, the usual financing developers play. And they said, why don't we bid out 20 miles instead of 5 miles? Why don't we bid out 20 miles of the system and see if there's someone who wants to do that? And they'll find a finance. They've had proposals. I haven't seen them yet. But I'm just saying, this is the edge that we're playing with here. There's public capital that's available that wants to find places to go. And if we put the infrastructure in there with the certainty, create the certainty that you're going to get these more densely compacted areas that will drive the kinds of returns, they can repay the loans for the infrastructure. But it's not one where we're sort of ready from a public finance point of view because of the way we think about these things. We think about them, oh, the city has to guarantee these. So it's in the district, it goes under the debt cap, and you have to be careful about that. So we're in effect almost too prudent and have yet these very large-scale financing projects. And if you look at the rest of the world, those which we saw today, those cities, they're doing mega projects. We're still doing 2 million here, 4 million here, 5 million there, and it's not going to cut it. So we're going to have to dramatically think differently. And when you think about these areas, how do you get to these urban places, as we talk about? We have the potential for that, but it's going to need huge infrastructure investment. So I just offer this as a whole different way to think
So
about
he's, the interesting thing what he's saying is that the business guy knows right away, do the whole system. But DDOT's first instinct is, let's just do a little bit because I can figure out how to do that. And I don't mean to be critical sounding, but it sounded like that's the way the conversation unfolded from what I participated. So it requires leadership, Rashawn. It requires somebody to sort of step in and say, wait a second. Other than the Chinese, can we think for ourselves about how to do this?
Yeah,
It puts our policymakers and our leaders, our political leaders, in a risk position, because for many years they'd have, and I'm just going to make up a couple, your parking ticket revenue, your X revenue, your Y revenue that takes care of the general fund. And these discussions are about, you want to grow your pie, take these 3 revenue sources and dedicate it to this specific infrastructure play. And then your other revenues will grow in a way to still cover police, fire, education. And that is a risky, a risk position that most politicians and political leaders have had a tough time to deal with. But it is where most other cities around the world are making those educated bets.
right. And I think you're absolutely right, Jeff. Because what you do is you take, and it's what we're doing in the county, is you're taking a limited resources that you have and saying, we're going to dedicate it to this area to do the whole thing. So, but it does mean that if you're focusing like we are in these 6 neighborhoods that we're going to transform, it means there are some places outside of that area which aren't going to have the same amount of attention because you don't have an unlimited amount of money.
Exactly.
So it is risky in the sense that you're going to hear complaints, and everybody likes to be reelected. but it means so it's a harder sell, as Jair just made. It's hard to explain to people, if we invest here with these limited amount and grow this is going to grow our pie, which in turn is going to benefit everybody. Right. It's going to help our education system. It's going to help pay for public safety. It's going to help pay for health care. But making that argument in real time is always hard, and it's politically risky because you're not going to see it right away. It is something that's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road.
Yeah, very good, Rich.
Can I just come back on that? I think it requires different kinds of institutions to make this happen, special purpose corporations that have to be created. And I think in the case of Maryland, that's probably a state-backed corporation that comes in. And in fact, probably, and this is what a friend of mine who was invited, I guess, down to work at the Treasury on TARP said the biggest failure he felt was the inability to convince the president that of the money that went into the renewal of the country, that $100 million should have gone into an investment trust fund. But if you had that and you had the states backing these, so you take some of the risk away from the local politician, because the local politician is right at that edge. It's very hard to make that decision. Tony Williams, for example, did not support our initiative about downtown housing. He said, I can't support downtown housing. If I put any money in downtown housing, I'm going to be politically killed. It was Linda Kropp. He said, but go over see Linda, and Linda will introduce it in the council. She's at large. I think she can handle this for it. She said, I'm for it, but I can't come out for it. And that's the dynamic we have, and we get caught in it's almost like too much democracy here. But what am I suggesting here is, because I think that's the wrong.
I didn't say that.
No, because the flip side, I would argue, is that bids are much more than too much democracy. We really work at that. But I think you have to create these other institutions that are the ones that will have that power and authority that can come in and step into these projects in which there's a state or federal or local need and take that risk. So in the district, I think we'll be back looking at special purpose corporations to make some of this stuff happen, through which these dedicated revenues go and these third parties can contract to make this stuff work. So that's a level, it's order of magnitude. I mean, and it doesn't take away, I think, from the nuts and bolts kinds of things that we're all talking about, because at one level you do have to get to come off the sidewalk, you do have to have security, you have to have maintenance, you have to have all of that at the high standards, so that has to work. But we can get lost sometimes by being too low here and think that that's going to give us the place, when if we really want to go to scale in the country or in the county, you're going to have to think new institutions, new funding, and new ways to organize these in conjunction with state and federal agencies.
Yeah, very good. So let's take a few questions. Please, here, sir. If you know what, if I could ask you to stand and then say your name.
Yes. Good evening, good morning. My name is Andy Giraldi. I am a graduate student at Michigan State University's training program. My question was inspired by Rich's comment on branding and partially on identity. What goes into defining the identity of a community or town that wants to market itself to a certain population of sorts? And how much does placemaking attributes, i.e. parks, transit, museums, go into defining the branding or identity of these places?
Okay, it was a little hard to hear the last part. Did you get,
Right. It's
please, go.
Yeah, I think there's a question, because we went through it. First of all, it's a bit expensive. We spent, a good $100,000 in our case to take a look at ourselves. And what you do is you basically look at those sorts of values that you have in the community, and you sort of say, these are the values have, and these are how we're performing relative to those values. And what are the ones where we have some, if you like, almost exemplifiers of our ability to do that, and what's aspirational. And it's in that space. Mm-hmm. So in our case, if a remarkable urban place is something that's of consequence, things like parks become important. But our problem is that our parks are passive. So we're now engaged with the National Park Service and the city. How can we make our parks, lively? But they're an amenity to us. Or bikes become important to us, so we spend a lot of time on that. It falls off the kind of core values that you have and want to have. And if walkability is one of those, which is a value we have, or we want to reduce congestion, we follow those through, though. But the brand becomes very important. But I think it's important to see that, and you can see this in the other bids. Michael, I know we'll talk this afternoon. And each of us there's a little different edge that we have. But it gives us some distinction, and I think that's true of neighborhoods. People want to feel there's something different they can identify. A brand's also something that has emotional qualities to it that you can kind of believe in. And many of us actually in bid world now think of ourselves as much as brand-driven as we are vision-driven. What's the nature of the experience we're going to provide, as opposed to these are the buildings we're going to have. I mean, we can share that, but it's really an experiential kind of thing, which is really what the brand world's all about. So branding is a very important element, I think, in placemaking, and in fact, there's a whole world called place branding.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I just think of some of the places that have created great brands for themselves, like Charleston, South Carolina. And what's very interesting about that is Mayor Riley there absolutely got his constituency part of that value discussion before the brand was actually created, and having them be part of the aspiration of we're going to provide someone an authentic experience in the South really starts becoming the early seeds of what ends up becoming a very strong brand and a great tourism and an economic development strategy.
Yeah, Rich.
You have places like Tacoma Park, which, for better or worse, kind of evolve a brand. Sometimes that can be limiting. Sometimes it can be expansive. But we do have examples here of neighborhoods that really do develop brands.
That's right.
And communities very much. I would just say the flip side is that there's a big battle going on in Upper Northwest along Wisconsin Avenue about the idea of brand. Is the brand an urban brand or is the brand a suburban brand? Right.
That's interesting.
But someone has to pay attention to that. And find a way to make that edge work, because there's one of the huge undeveloped assets in the city that is being developed at almost suburban scale at the moment.
You think in the county, if you look at our arts district, there was no arts district. In fact, Peter had to import the artists into that district to make it an arts district. But now no one thinks that, it's the arts district. Everyone knows it. They know where it is in the county throughout, and it's developed. But it was branding. It was the branding that went in first, and then it was the attraction of artist housing. It was the attraction of what does that mean when you say an arts district? What does it look like? And mostly it looked urban and it looked funky, and that became what people sense, and it's grown from there. But that was a branding that established this designated area.
I presume this is sort of going on now in College Park. I mean, that you
Right.
now have some major development plans. I mean,
Right.
College Park has never been thought about as a college town the way Charlottesville is.
Exactly.
But why couldn't it be? You know, given its scale and size and what it does and what it means, in fact, more so than Charlottesville. But I
excellent
presume
point.
that you're
Yeah.
engaged in trying to
That's-
figure that out right
and-
now.
And we are. I mean, excellent point. I mean, College Park now and the development around College Park with Dr. Lowe there is saying, looking at these other places and saying, well, why don't we have it here? And we have density there. And now it's going to develop, and we're putting resources into it from the county.
Oh, fascinating. Please, here.
Kathy Lewis, I'm with Fairfax County.
Hey, Kathy.
Question for you, in terms of these place-making organizations, neighborhood improvement districts, business improvement districts, how do you see the best way for them to form? Is it bottom up or is it top down? I mean, right now, the reason I asked is in Tyson's, we're seeing a lot of resistance to developers to even forming, a unified owners organization, that they want to get in, they want to sell their properties off, and they want to get out. And, they're very resistant to having, some kind of commitment to even an organization within, what might be just 20 acres to, try and form and discuss issues with regard to streetscape, the look of the neighborhood. So I just wanted to hear your comments on
So, Kathy, who did you address that to?
anybody.
Okay. Well, let's take the last part of that first, if you don't mind. And I was thinking that I don't know that you guys get enough credit for having formed Mount Vernon Triangle. And is that really? And so what she's describing is a heavy lift. But you sat around the table with those guys week after week after week and formed an improvement district. Talk about that.
Well, this is an area immediately adjacent to us, which when we looked at it, at one point in time, we saw the sum total of development there is about 7 million square feet. It's larger than Hartford. So, but it seemed like, wasn't that important. But we thought, gee, if we could help organize, but it wasn't quite us yet. So again, this became an art, but we got the property owners together. But luckily in that case, being adjacent to the downtown, they kind of could see the benefit and could see to take the steps. But they also started out with a very different kind of program. So I guess I would like to answer your first question by saying it's both. It's top down, bottom up. And it's also about having, quite frankly, there's no cookie cutter here. The bids can do sometimes it's just a matter of putting holiday lights. Sometimes it's a matter of doing nothing but planning. Steve's about to work on one that's in the southwest section here, which is going to take a lot of planning, a lot of branding. It's not going to be operationally based. But it's creative. But I think it's really important, however, for the government to signal it's prepared and ready and encouraging that. We certainly benefited from Charlene Jarvis, who's a council chair, council member who put a lot of time and effort. Jack Evans. So it was easy for the business community to say that's what we're going to be welcomed here. And so I think it goes that way. But then it's ultimately the thing about these particular organizations is they have to operate independent from the government. That's the other part. They have to be guided by the policies about it, and they have to be close to it because they can't go off track. But they can't be subject to the oversight, the normal oversight, because you want them to have the flexibility. But we're sort of like I always feel like we're a related cousin, who's a little bit different than the rest of the family. But we're part of that broader family. So I think it's both ways, but you really have to have clear, and in some cases, New York City, I think, is doing a great job now at the moment. They really actively, they provide planning grants sometimes. The things they do to help push it forward. They're even got a program now for smaller areas whereby 4 or 5 of them will be able to share staff. So they've actually created a kind of consortium which they can buy the staff from them. So New York is fully committed to do this, but they recognize in some areas they're only going to raise $50,000, $70,000. That can't support the overhead of an executive or what have you. So I think you'll see this grow as a way of the government's finding a way with the private sector to encourage that. But they can't be it. I mean, every time the government pays for one of those bids to get started, you can almost promise it will die because there is no investment.
Each of you guys, if you would, respond to this. Jair, first. Some advice for her. you're sitting around the table with a group of guys, and 2 of them really want to get in and get out.
Well, one of the things that when you sit around the table and have that discussion about, you know, we call it a character-defining moment, when someone really describes, we're in, we're out, we have really no concern about what happens and the placemaking that happens long-term, versus a company like ourselves that wants to be there and invest multiple times in the same place because we think that it actually creates value. It's just a different business proposition. But when you have that mentality, what we find is that there's some things that tie us all together, and that's taxes and other things. And if a component of taxes goes into a fund, then it makes it somewhat agnostic of whether or not you worry about this owner or that owner. You actually pull everyone together. That's one thing. The second thing is that it is now becoming, through studies like Chris's and others, where the value proposition is evident even in a short-term basis. That if there's lively streets, if there's active retail, that you will get a higher purchase price, a lower cap rate, whatever you want to describe, for different asset classes. And so I think that the combination of kind of unifying components as well as more intrinsic data that provides real-time information, you're going to start getting those folks in the same room. And then you also have many other things that tie us all together. Planning departments, other adjacent communities, coalitions that run across the region, like the Coalition for Smart Growth. There are different things that can create these tentacles into that big fish that you want to get on the boat.
Rich is saying he needs you at the table, and he needs a light touch.
And so we come in with a heavy touch, usually at the beginning of the discussion, because I think that's what you find, at least when you have developers who want to come in, get in, and get out. So usually at the beginning of the discussion is, here's what we expect. We talked about College Park and what we expect around College Park. Well, the master developer, the beginning discussion is about what we expect after it's developed. What type of ongoing process and maintenance is going to take place, whether it's a nonprofit community development corporation, whether it's like a bid that comes in and manages it. But that's the discussion you have in the front, because there's usually an ask. As Jair said, there's usually something you need from government, whether it's permitting, whether it's streetscape, whatever it is. That's when we have the greatest opportunity to say, here's what we expect. Here's what we want to see happen. Here's what we want to see created. And here's the partnership. And I think that's how you approach it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to suggest, I think the real estate industry is going through another change and expansion, and that is really to understand what asset appreciation means. And that's different than build it, and sell it, and make your money, harvest it, and then go out. But it's to build it and hold it. I mean, you have on one end of the spectrum, you have the REITs, the public traded companies, whose job is to do precisely that and hold it for long periods of time. Or you have companies somewhere, at least in Washington, that's a Boston Properties or a kind of property. Or then you have companies like JBG, who will buy, hold for a while, and then sell a whole portfolio. But they basically have managed those in such a way to gain new value, and then they start the cycle on the other. And then you have some who build, but increasingly, we're understanding that the idea of holding an asset and growing is useful for you, even if for no other purpose, then you can use that asset to build something new, as opposed to just selling. So you hold it in your portfolio like we all do in our own personal way. This is becoming increasingly important. And we have companies in the region now, and Tishman is a good example of them. Tishman, I think, has like close to 7 million square feet of space that they own and control. They're not developing anything new here. But what Brian's doing when he goes to meetings of portfolio managers is this is the asset base to fund projects in Rio or in in India or some other place. So my point of that's at that larger scale, but the local scale, people are realizing that. And I think that we should begin to look at developers not just simply as in and out, but as asset managers. And in fact, we're doing the very same thing of thinking about a neighborhood, an area, and increasing its value. That's what I think a lot of what Chris is talking about here is this asset appreciation. If we all get together, we can, in effect, make the thing better. So I think we're going to find a shift, if you like, in terms of developers and others who begin to realize there's a different way to play this game. You can harvest value there, and the counties and the governments harvest value not by just spending all their time on building things, but by investing in asset management.
Yeah, very good. So one final question. So Chris's work makes a compelling case, complicated case, about where value comes from, what occurs in walkable urban places, what's driving sort of real estate, people's decisions about where to locate their lives, etc. The question is really pretty simple. Are you persuaded, Rich,
Persuaded that
by his work? Does it compel you to make changes in what you do? Does it validate kind of work you're doing already? How does it live for you? How do you take it away from here?
Oh, I mean, you know, I certainly appreciate Chris is very kind to us. He says nice things about us. He travels around, and so we're into branding and communication. Anything that says nice about us, that's good. We'll take it. So I think it's very affirming. And I like the focus. What Chris brings in particular is this focus attention on place management. That attention. It's not excluding development and design and other things, but that needs to be heard. So I think that's very useful. But I don't think any of us think, for example, that in alone is enough. I mean, the whole notion of build it, they'll come, manage it, and they'll stay. You put it in a cornfield. You know, I think I've seen pictures of that movie set. People still go there, but it's not enough. There are market forces. There are lots of other things you have to do. So I would just say I think it's an important element, and I think of great value. And I think it's great that we're getting attention to it, just as bringing the attention to the social equity issues.
Yeah, very much.
Are really, really terribly important.
Yep.
So in that sense, I welcome that because it brings a focus of attention on things we need to do to create these places.
Yeah, very good. Jair, how would you respond to that?
Well, in a similar fashion, you know, you love when Chris starts making very, very cool analogies that the past generation of developers were race car drivers that drove fast and drove left, and the current generation of developers like myself are more like Air Force pilots that can fly up, down, left, right, and spin around 6 ways because we're doing mixed-use projects in urban neighborhoods. But more importantly, his work really sets the stage to splinter out, you know, almost in a viral sense, to the entire to every corner of the real estate industry, because that's the only way it all moves. I can have great ideas, but if I can't convince an appraiser or a lender or an equity partner to run with me, then it's very difficult. If I can't convince a municipality to run with me, it's very difficult. Or whoever the thought leader is in how we're redefining what urban places can be in this country, and how we've missed the 50 years of urban development that has happened in many other cities around the world because we've concentrated on so much suburban development. That affirmation in all components of the industry is very, very much important, so that 2 years, 3 years down the line, like I did 2-3 years ago talking about Walk Score, now I can actually get lenders, appraisers, thought leaders in the industry to say, wait a minute, that's normal to think about Walk Score, and now this type of work will help us think about walk-ups in the future, and how that can be instrumental in the entire value creation of the built environment. So it's very, very important work that Chris is doing, and we appreciate it.
Rashoon, how do you respond?
Well, I think the point that were made and the work is, for us in Prince George's County, is probably very key and very substantial in the sense that the growth of Prince George's County is within those urban corridors. And so the thought of what has taken place in the district and walkable communities and how you build around it and concentrate on it, for us is where we have the greatest potential to grow. I also believe it's the greatest potential to grow for the state. And so being able to take works like Chris's and take it to Annapolis and say, really, if you want to see the state grow both in population, commercial development, and mixed-use areas and a good bang for your buck, here's where you ought to invest in. So it's a great tool for us to use when we're persuading our other partner, which is really the state, to come and invest in Prince George's County.
Yeah. Gentlemen, what a thoughtful and interesting hour. Let me, on behalf of everybody, thank you for this morning's discussion. Rich Bradley is the Executive Director of the Downtown Business Improvement District. Jair Lynch is the President and CEO of Jair Lynch Development Partners. And of course, the Honorable Rashawn Baker is the County Executive for Prince George's County. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.